Tanse Tawa, welcome everyone to our special presentation with our special guest, Waubgeshig Rice. Before we begin though, I want to start our day in a good way. Sorry, it's already been a long day. But I'd like to get us started in a good way with our special guest, Anders Hunters, who's from the Minithni community, who's here to share a bit of the territory and get us grounded. Thank you again, Anders, for coming and supporting our series.
Amba that's the Hantoga hair, Wakane, is Nisu, Jawad, Doka, Amba, Theongo Kubin. Ne, Tehanda, he know where the Dokane will part in Kavitawano. Ze, Odagize Dambita, Tao, Ibadam, the Onsa Pincha, Nane, Chinustawad. Thank you very much. Welcome here in Nakota Makochi. We are Nakota people. We're originally Assiniboine, but we are from the Dakota branch, so to speak. But, you know, settlers called the Stonies because our tools and our weapons and everything, our ancestors were made out of stone. So they're like, okay, Stonies, right on. But really, we're Assiniboine. I just want to welcome everybody here and our special guest here in Minihpa Makochi, also known as Nakota Makochi, Banff, where the waterfall starts. And this area used to be our own national park. You know, we would do our hunting, our medicine picking, our berry picking. I don't know if this area was specifically used for vision quests. I'm not sure about that, but for sure we've done many things in the traditional way, in the traditional Nakota way, and we still do do our hunting, we still do our medicine harvests, everything like that, and the only difference is we pay taxes now. Yeah, but anyway, thank you very much, and I'd like to sing a short song to welcome everyone here to Nakota Makochi. Again, it's Sneeze for being here. Way ya yeah yeah ya eh ya yeah way ya hey ya oh ya eh ya hey hey Sneeze, welcome.
Tiniki Magwitch, thank you for getting us started in a good way. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Janine Windolf, and I'm the Director of Indigenous Arts. I'm pleased to call Banff home, or where I play now. For the past 6 years, I've been here many years. I brought my 2 children, Delari and Corwin, who are now turning 19 and 21, and they're actually the reason I came to Banff. So, you know, for me, when we think about decolonizing the narrative, you know, I often share my journey, but I also share the journey with my family. And I often mark those with the ages that my children were. And when I meet up with someone again, it's always a conversation about the last time I seen you with your kids. So the reason I share that is because I was blessed about 5 years ago to cross paths virtually. And I do want to acknowledge our virtual guests on Zoom who are joining us today. That long ago, you know, I was very skeptical, I'm going to be honest, of Zoom. I was like, I don't want to be sitting on no Zoom when the pandemic hit. And then I realized after a while, you know, it was a tool that got me to connect. And we were also challenged as directors here, how do we engage and make online really proactive? Well, what I did learn, it wasn't always about making it active and exciting, it was making space for where people were at. So for often me, you'll see my child come give me a hug or a quick high five or being around. And so for our special guest here, my memory, and he's heard this 3 times, he's like, Janine, get a new story. We'll make new stories. But, you know, on Zoom, I was quite delighted when Waub came with his young child and was giving a presentation, most happy, active baby, just talking, flippant, talking, and the wife coming in, grabbing baby for a little bit, and then presenting, and then all of a sudden, whoosh, baby's back there. And you know, sometimes we have to make space for where we're at in these times that we come. So, you know, for me, I'm very blessed that I have adult children now who will be taking those steps, but, you know, I definitely had an arts practice with children by my side. And so for me, I always think, you know, what it means to you depends on your journey. So I always like to share that journey. So my family's originally from Waswanipi Cree Nation in Quebec. So from my mom's side, we're Atikamekw Cree. And I was taught we say Jabwe, where I come from. And so my dad's side is Woodland Cree, and we're from La Ronge, Saskatchewan, so Treaty 6 area. And I shared that because I was actually just talking about the diversity even at the table. So sometimes the diversity at the dinner table, because we come from so many places we were raised, we have our bloodline, those who shared with us, and the people that influence us along the way. And so for me, I always work with who's at my table and make space for those gifts. And so along the way, I've met a lot of people who have brought not only themselves, but when they share those stories of their family, where they come from, you know, what brought them to the center here, I always feel like that's a piece of medicine and treasure that people are giving, because we don't owe anyone anything and nobody owes us anything. So anything put is a privilege, is what I was taught. So I just want to share that and set the tone, because I'm really excited that we're going to be talking about oral storytelling today. And I'm not going to give away Waub's talking points, so I'm actually going to invite our special guest. And as I noted, I don't read bios, because as Indigenous people, we introduce ourselves. So I always feel weird when I'm a special guest and I'm smiling, and then I'm like, sheesh, my bio is so outdated. Oh yeah, I did that. And then after a while, you're like, okay. So we don't need to go through that. Without further ado, let's welcome our special guest to the podium.
I'm giving myself a long intro, so I need a drink of water. Bonjour, Waubgeshig Indigenous Arts, Makwa Ndodem. Wasaksing Ndonjaba, Anishinaabe, Minwa Jaganash Ndao, Minwa Swakmak Ndida. Hi everybody, my name is Waubgeshig Rice. You can call me Waub for short if you like. I'm a member of the Bear Clan of the Anishinaabe people of Wasaksing First Nation. That's an island community on Georgian Bay near Parry Sound, Ontario. I'm of Anishinaabe and Canadian heritage. That means my dad's from the res and my mom's from town. And I currently live in Sudbury, Ontario, which is also known as Swakamuck. And the lands where I grew up and where I currently reside are under the Robinson-Huron Treaty, which was signed in 1850. And I'd just like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to the people of Treaty 7 for welcoming me here tonight and over the years, and for hosting this event with you all. It just really means a lot to me to have this relationship with the Banff Centre. And I want to give credit to Janine and Ali and everybody in the Indigenous Arts for creating that space that you talked about. I've especially seen Indigenous Arts flourish from a distance here under your leadership, and it's really awesome to see the programming happening here this week. So I also want to give a shout out to Derek Beaulieu, who's also doing awesome stuff in the English department too. So it just means a lot to me to be here. It feels really special. And I just want to thank you all for coming out tonight. So talking about decolonizing the narrative is, the topic of discussion. Just to give you a little background on myself, 46 years old. I work primarily as an author. I'm a former journalist. I'm a journalist by trade. I graduated from what's now called Toronto Metropolitan University with a journalism degree back in 2002. I spent most of my journalism career with the CBC, but I took a leap off the mothership, as they say at CBC, about 5 years ago, to be a full-time writer, and just been very fortunate, very privileged to have been able to make a go of it. I have kind of an unconventional path to literature. I don't have any formal artistic training. I came into professional storytelling through journalism. But really, the foundation for me was laid by my family, my community, my Anishinaabe heritage, and really growing up at a special time for our community and my people. So when it comes to defining decolonization, I find that can be a pretty difficult thing to do. It really is a subjective term. It means different things to different people. I'm not going to attempt to define it right now, but hopefully what I share with you tonight will give you a glimpse into what decolonization means to my day-to-day life as just a dude, and my artistic practice as a writer, right? So yeah, like there's different ways we can approach decolonization. There's different ways we can sort of practice it and so on. I think for me, what I try to do is just share stories and share the truth and really feel empowered as an Anishinaabe person and as an Indigenous person who's of mixed heritage more generally, to be the conduit for our ancestors' stories, for our people's ways of life, for what's being revived, and really to open the circle to everybody else. Right? Because that was the original intent behind the treaty-making process, behind welcoming people here. And speaking of welcoming, I want to give a shout out to Anders too for that wonderful welcome, Chmiigwech. And I think how we, embody that on a daily basis is really important to acknowledge, whether we're Indigenous or we're not, you know? I think in an ideal world, if this was a truly decolonial event, you know, I'd be speaking entirely in Anishinaabe, and it'd be like the UN. You guys would all have those earpieces with translators, you know, Inuktitut, Nakota, Big Ma, you know, and so on. And French and English too, because my version of decolonization doesn't mean kicking out all the white people, you know, because then I'd have to give half my family the boot, right? Because I'm half white, you know. But I think what I want to do tonight is sort of just talk about what that path can be. Really demystify the literary arts or arts in general, because I think there's been such an emphasis on the pathway through a colonial institution to have a career in the arts, which is not necessarily how I came about it myself, right? So I'm going to talk about three different things. First, I'm going to talk about the bigger picture, how place itself can guide us into that decolonial process as individuals. And I'm going to talk about my own, you know, personal practice, specifically how my writing and my research and the development of stories of the last two books I've done, I think aligns with some of those things that I'm trying to do. And then I'm going to give like a few pointers, I guess. The subtitle of tonight's event is Adapting Oral Storytelling to Literature. That's a workshop I usually do with writing groups. And it's usually a smaller, more intimate thing with like a lot of interaction and exercises and so on. So we can't do that tonight, but what I'll do is just share some of those tips that I convey with writers groups, and hopefully, regardless of your artistic practice, you'll find some things that can be useful there. Because really, what it comes down to is community building, right? Like spending time with people, listening to people, giving them the space to share, documenting what they have to share with you, documenting your own experience, sharing that with others, and so on. Because it's all a very communal thing, and I think that's something that we should celebrate. And that's something that's celebrated regularly here at the Banff Centre, which is pretty awesome. So hopefully you'll be able to take away some of those pointers as well. As mentioned, an important first step in decolonizing the narrative of a state like Canada is telling the truth about the lands that we're from. So this is an image of where I grew up. That great big island that takes up most of this frame is called Waubgeshig, colonially known as Perry Island. It's where I grew up. It's my dad's home community, and my dad's here tonight. Forgot to mention that. They call him Uncle John here. He's with the Truth and Reconciliation gathering this week. So anything I share historically, I learned from him. And if I mess that up, he's here to be my fact checker, like on hand, right? So yeah, he'll pipe up if I mess something up, right? Every Indigenous person somehow is descended from a very specific land base with very specific stories, very specific teachings. But the act of colonization has been to detach us from these land bases, right? And not just that, further brutalize us out of those stories, out of those memories, out of those teachings, and so on, through measures like day schools, residential schools, and even less overt violent measures, like just the general shame that the Canadian state imposes upon Indigenous people. To get back to where we need to be, I think, it is a long journey for a lot of us, but understanding where we're from and the original stories of our places can really help get on that path of decolonizing the narrative of Canada, right? So you'll see in the sort of upper right corner of this image, there's a settlement at that river there. That's the town of Parry Sound. So that's where my mom is from, by way of Kapuskasing, Ontario. And that's sort of a renowned place in so-called cottage country, Ontario. Bobby Orr is from there. He's, Parry Sound's claim to fame. And there's a narrative of Parry Sound that long has neglected our Anishinaabe contributions or history in the area, right? So that river that you see is called the Seguin River, and the Truth and Reconciliation group will remember my dad mentioning the Seguin River this morning. We didn't make notes and plan this. This is just like a funny coincidence, right? I guess a result of intergenerational teachings, right, that I'm sharing the same thing that he shared this morning. But one of our original settlements was at the mouth of that river. Is where our ancestors lived in the summertime a lot, and also they would spend some summer months out on the island as well. But when Canada was confederated and when settlement was underway in the mid-19th century, our ancestors were forced out onto the island to live full-time. So this island has always been a revered part of our history. There are several sacred sites there. Travelers who would go up and down Georgian Bay and Lake Huron would often stop there for holy ceremonies and so on, right? But Canada said, okay, you Indians can't live here at the mouth of the Seguin River anymore. You have to go out onto this island, which was ultimately a world-ending event, very traumatic. And so what emerged at the Seguin River there is the town of Parry Sound. And this is a mural that's on Seguin Street, right across the Seguin Bridge that spans the Seguin River. And it harkens back to the logging era of Parry Sound. So the story we're told about Parry Sound is that there were industrious logging settlers who came in and began the town into prosperity. So there's a big mural right when you come into downtown Parry Sound that commemorates that, right? But obviously there's no very vivid representation of Indigenous people or Anishinaabe people or so on. So that's the story of Parry Sound. So from that perspective. But when you consider what had happened to our ancestors, which was that displacement, and then ultimately the total defacement of the land itself, it was an apocalyptic moment. So this is an image from the Parry Sound Harbor from, I think the late 19th century. And it's really hard to make out, but what you see there are logs just fully covering the harbor in Parry Sound. In that sort of ridge of landscape you see in the background, that's the reserve, that's the island, that's Wissahickon, right? So you had these people who had lived at this settlement since time immemorial being forced out onto this island, not allowed to leave because it was illegal under the Indian Act to leave the reserve without permission from the Indian agent. And as they were confined to the space that they couldn't leave, they saw the mainland being ravaged for the benefit of colonialism, capitalism, and the new settlements that began to thrive there and so on. And we'll get back to this later and how it relates to the writing that I've done. But that is the story of the history of where we live, and I think the trauma that we've had to endure intergenerationally for the past almost 200 years and so on. But I was really lucky to be raised with this awareness of this history and lived through a moment that sort of aimed to reverse that cycle of trauma that was imposed upon us. And growing up in the 1980s and 90s, there was, sort of a cultural renaissance of sorts happening in Wasauksing, in our home community. And one really important thing that happened was educational sovereignty. So what existed in Wasauksing for a long time before I was there was a day school. So we're all familiar with the day school system. It was called Ryerson Indian Day School. My dad and his siblings went there. But by the time I went there with my cousins and friends of my cohort back in the 1980s, it was a day school in name only. It was still called Ryerson Indian Day School, but our community had asserted control over it, thanks to advocacy, thanks to awareness, and really, a strong-hearted community effort to ensure that the young people in our community, the children, had the opportunity to be raised with culture, stories, and so on, right? So this is a clipping from the Parry Sound North Star from October 16th, 1984. The kid standing second from the left with like the hockey helmet hairdo, that's me, right? Very fashionable in the mid-1980s, obviously. And in the middle is our chief at the time, Flora Tababarang. She was a long-standing chief in our community, almost 30 years. And this was newsworthy because it was the first time our school was able to expand beyond kindergarten. So when our community first gained control of the school, it was kindergarten only, junior, senior kindergarten. And then the kids would have to go into nearby Parry Sound for the rest of the elementary and high schooling and so on, right? But thanks to that ongoing advocacy, the school was expanded. So I was amongst the first cohort that went into grade 1, grade 2, and so on, and then eventually graduated from grade 8. And the name was changed to Wasauksing Kino Magelgamik, which was Wasauksing School. So this is an integral part of our educational process, was having elders come in, share stories with us about our culture. The fun, entertaining, and informative trickster stories like the Nana Bush stories. Also, community history, family history. Often we'd have knowledge keepers come in and take us out into the bush, to harvest sumac or birch bark or set rabbit snares and so on, right? So it was like real hands-on decolonial learning, which was pretty awesome, and it was, I think, kind of revolutionary, maybe a bit ahead of its time back then, 40 years ago or so. So Flora there is telling us the story of the Kokoko, which is the story of the owl. How it came to be. There's a Nana Bush story about that. So this was a huge deal. And ultimately, this sort of decolonial act of indigenizing education for me and for my peers set many of us on a very, I think, proud and empowered path to be proud of ourselves, to share our stories, to learn more about culture, and to share our culture with others more proudly in town, and so on. So that really is, I think, how it started for me. And again, I'm just so grateful that this was my childhood in my home community, and that's, why I have these tools that I have today to write and to tell stories and so on. So all that considered, I eventually really gravitated towards storytelling. I recognized the importance of remembering these stories, sharing them, being proud of them, the inherent narrative flexibility that you could have when telling an Indigenous story. Basically, you can make it your own as long as the point remains the same and the same pillars remain the same. And it was just a really cool way to engage with not only culture and history, but just, my own sense of identity and self and so on. And I think that's really what gave me the confidence eventually to want to write fiction on my own. So I'm the author of 4 books. My first 2 books are a short story collection and a novel called Midnight Sweat Lodge and Legacy, published by Thetis Books. But tonight I'm going to talk more about my 2 recent novels called Moon of the Crusted Snow and Moon of the Turning Leaves. And fun fact, 10 years ago, I started writing Moon of the Crusted Snow here in Banff. So it's always nice to come back here and share this story. So if you're unfamiliar with these stories, they're designated as post-apocalyptic or dystopian fiction. I'm fine with that. They got to go on the shelf somewhere. They got to, You got to find them online somewhere. I got to make money somehow. So the categories, I guess, help in that sense. But I see them more as like post-industrial, post-state, and regenerative stories about us as Anishinaabe and as Indigenous people more broadly. They're about a world-ending event in a Northern Ontario Anishinaabe community, which ultimately becomes a new opportunity for this community to start over and reclaim a lot of the old ways now that the state has collapsed, and they're liberated to roam freely and to reenact what they feel they need from their traditional culture and history and so on, right? So Moon of the Crested Snow was published in 2018. It was only going to be one story. I thought, I did what I wanted to do with that story, but very privileged to have some enthusiastic readers who encouraged me to write a sequel, which came out in 2023, Moon of the Turning Leaves. So I'll talk about the specifics between both shortly. But the main moment of inspiration for Moon of the Crested Snow was what's called the Northeast Blackout of 2003. So if some of you are from out east and are my age or a little bit younger or a little bit older, you'll remember what this was. In August of 2003, there was this widespread blackout that impacted several states and a big chunk of Ontario and a small part of Quebec. And ultimately, about 55 million people or so were without power. Some for just a couple days, some for a couple weeks, right? And it was a pretty, I think, shocking event for a lot of people. It was really eye-opening for others too, because at first there was, no answers. It was very mysterious how this blackout happened. So this is a shot of the Toronto skyline. You can see the CN Tower there, in utter darkness, right? With torches literally lighting the way. Very cool image. I still, get chills from seeing it all these years later. I was living in Toronto at the time, working as a freelance journalist, but I was home on the res when this happened. And this is a whole long story. I don't have time to tell it. But basically, I was there with my two younger brothers at our dad's place. And when the lights went out, we didn't think too much of it. But as the day went on, and as we talked to more people, we thought this shit had hit the fan. We were like, this is it. This is the big one, But better find, those shotgun shells just in case, right? And all that. So my brothers and I made all these plans for the end of the world because we legit thought it was the end of the world. But as the day went on, we started thinking a little more about where we were in our home community and the fact that we were surrounded by resourceful people who, still knew how to hunt, how to harvest from the land, how to make shelter, how to, clean everything and so on, right? And it was really comforting. We had this revelation that being on the res in this moment was the best place to be. And it was hugely empowering too. And I've always been proud to come from the res, but to feel that safety in the reserve in a different way at a moment that I thought was the end of the world was even more prideful, right? It was a really cool moment. The next day came around and the power came back on and we forgot about our survival plan already. We're back to playing video games and all that, right? But the moment really stuck with me, and I went back to Toronto a couple days later to go back to work and just thought more about it, heard more stories about what happened, and I thought, it'd be really cool someday to explore this in some kind of story, right? And back then, in 2003, I was 24, and, writing fiction was still just a dream. I just started my journalism career, but, it had fully embedded itself in the back of my head, and I wanted to explore it someday, somehow. I just didn't know when that would happen, right? So about a year after the blackout, I was visiting my grandmother, the late Aileen Rice. That's me, with a lot of hair as a one-year-old, and her at her cabin on the res. Very influential person in my life. Many teachings I received from her, very grateful to have had her presence and so on. I was visiting her about a year after that happened, that blackout. And we're sitting in her living room watching TV. And in media, there's always anniversary coverage of big events, right? Like a year later, let's look back at this thing. So there are these news promos that came on during the YNR, because of course that's what I was watching with my grandma, Young and the Restless, for global news, right? And they're like, oh yeah, the blackout 1 year later, where were you? So I turned to her and I was like, yeah, Graham, remember that blackout? That was pretty wild, eh? Me and the guys there, we thought it was like the end of the world. And she kind of went, oh, end of the world, kind of brushed me off, right? And she's like, end of the world, that's happened to us so many times, right? It's nothing new, we can make it through that. And then she started reminding me of all those things that happened that I explained earlier, of the displacement from the land, of the logging, of the forbidden nature of being Anishinaabe, not being able to practice language and culture or leave the reserve. And she told me that she heard stories from her grandparents' generation about when that happened, because her grandparents were descended from the people who were forced off, right? And she said, yeah, that's just a few generations removed from you. That's not far off, that end of the world, But look at us now. Look, we're still here, right? You guys are at the drum again. You're dancing. You're going in sweat lodges. You're fasting. You don't have the language quite yet, but, you're working on it and so on. So it was a really profound moment to have her give me this teaching and remind me that despite all those traumas, all those apocalyptic moments, we're still resilient enough to be ourselves as Anishinaabe, right? So I wanted to, document that or immortalize that moment in Moon of the Crusted Snow. So Moon of the Crusted Snow, quick synopsis, is about this community that endures this blackout. And because the people are more resourceful, they're able to respond, I think, in a positive and beneficial way. Eventually, things start to crumble a bit, and then a visitor arrives from the south, throwing everything out of whack, right? So it's an allegory for colonialism, obviously, but it's, I hope, a more positive look at what we can reclaim and what we can regenerate if given the opportunity to start over. So this passage, I'll read you this really quickly. It's from chapter 22 of Moon of the Crusted Snow. And the main character, Evan, is visiting the key elder figure named Aileen. Also, I named her after my grandma as an homage. So Evan's visiting her, making sure she has, firewood, food, et cetera, et cetera. And he says, this moment we're living through, some people say apocalypse, like it's the end of the world. So I'll pick it up with the dialogue there. Yes, apocalypse, what a silly word. I can tell you there's no word like that in Ojibwe. Well, I never heard a word like that from my elders anyway. Evan nodded, giving the elder his full attention. The world isn't ending, she went on. Our world isn't ending. It already ended. It ended when the Jagnash came into our original home down south on that bay and took it from us. That was our world. When the Jagnash cut down all the trees and fished all the fish and forced us out of there, that's when our world ended. They made us come all the way up here. This is not our homeland. But we had to adapt, and luckily we already knew how to hunt and live on the land. We learned how to live here. She became more animated as she went on. Her small hands swayed as she emphasized the words she wanted to highlight. But then they followed us up here and started taking our children away from us. That's when our world ended again. And that wasn't the last time. That wasn't the last time. We've seen what's the word again? He says apocalypse, and she says, yes, apocalypse. We've had that over and over, but we're still here and we'll always be here, essentially is the key message she leaves him with. So that was my attempt of decolonizing the narrative around apocalyptic literature, I guess, based entirely on this moment I had with my grandmother after this profound historical event in our area. So taking it into the second story, Moon of the Turning Leaves, it takes place about 10 years after the end of Moon of the Crusted Snow, which is 12 years after the original blackout. And what we find is largely the same characters, the same community. So there will be some slight spoilers. If you haven't read the second book, I'll try to, mute them as much as possible. But in the second book, the community moves away from their original reserve into a new settlement that they've created in the bush. And this is their new beginning, right? This is their liberated new epoch as Anishinaabe. And after all this time in the bush, though, they recognize that, they've been stationary. They've been utilizing pretty much all the natural resources around them. from food to natural supplies and so on. And they recognized that, traditionally as Anishinaabe, they would have been migratory. They would have moved from settlement to settlement throughout the course of the year, allowing the land to replenish itself at each settlement and so on. So they decide that maybe it's time, to finally move, to finally go back down south to their original homeland. So you heard Aileen talk about how they originally were from down south. It's explained in the first book that they were displaced to far northern Ontario, which happened historically to several Indigenous communities. They were moved hundreds of kilometers from their original homelands, and this happened to this fictional community too. So with this new dilemma that they're facing of resources dwindling, they decide, well, we have to go look for someplace else to live. Let's see if we can go back to our original homelands down on the north shore of Lake Huron, of Georgian Bay. So they know that they can't do this whole exodus at first, so they send this exploratory group of people to go to see if they can still live there, but also to piece together what's happened in the 12 years since the blackout. Has the world actually ended? They don't know, because they've isolated themselves, right? So this is a sketch of the 6 main characters, that group that goes on this venture. This is a sketch that my cousin Waubgeshig, also known as Joshua Pei-Westekli, did for the novel. You can find it in the first few pages. So the character at the top that's Evan, and just below him is Nungos, is his daughter. So in the first book, Evan and Nicole's children, Maingan and Nungos, are just little kids. They're 3 and 5 years old. But since this one's set farther into the future, they're teens, young adults, and Nungos negotiates her way into going on this quest with him, right? So it really becomes like a quest of discovery. So I can't give too much away if you haven't read it yet. But it to me was, I think, more of a decolonial act for me to imagine this future and to show these Anishinaabe rightfully reclaiming their homelands and being themselves, not hindered by any state or any outside influences and so on. They still come across various antagonizing forces on their quest, and you have to read it to see what kind of wild and wacky adventures they get up to. But I'll read you another passage, this time from this book. And you'll see some slight similarities, and I'll explain why when I'm done it. So this is from chapter 2, when they decide they have to have a meeting about these dwindling resources and that, maybe it's time to go. So this is Walter, who's the new sort of de facto central elder in the community, holding this meeting. For all of Evan's life before the blackout, his community had been consigned to one place. Generations had been unable to move and live in the old way, and by Evan's childhood, the majority of their food and supplies came to them. It wasn't a lot, but they survived. Even then, they still went out into the bush to get whatever else they needed. But for the last 10 years, hunting and harvesting were how they'd been getting all their food. The other big problem is with these gigonyik, Walter continued. We've been using the net too much, and that big lake, it just can't keep up. We're not the only ones who need the fish. The birds do too, and they need the monomen. If we take too much, everything else could suffer. There needs to be a balance with all the life in the waters around us. Right now, we're upsetting that balance. Evan sensed several bodies around him readjusting nervously. Tyler's eyes were cast to the ground. We're all too young to have experienced this, but this has happened before, Walter went on. It's what happened to our ancestors when they used to live on those big waters down south, before they were pushed up here. The Jagnashuk brought in big boats with big nets, and they took almost all the fish out of the lakes. Then they cut all the trees down. It was in a different lifetime and in a different world, really, but it wasn't that long ago. That was Jibwa, back before. And when the lights went out and we lost everything we had from the world of the Jagnashuk, we were given a chance to live another way. We left where we were and we came out here. As hard as that was, and as many as we lost, it's part of our history. A log crumbled into embers in the fire, sending up a crackle of sparking ash. I tell you all this tonight, Walter said, because I think we're going to have to make a decision soon. Another matter of life or death for our people. A soft, expectant clamor moved over the group. Walter paused to allow the brief confusion to calm. We need to go back home, he said. Evan felt his chest pound. He looked at Tyler, who gazed back stoically this time. He turned to his parents and saw their hands clasped on his mother's knee. Megan and the younger ones kept their eyes locked on Walter, awaiting an explanation. We've been up here for so long that some of us forget where we originally came from, he continued. And I don't think the young ones hear enough about our real homelands, where the birch trees grow by the big water. The land is who we are. It's time to undo what's been done to us. It's time to go back home. So, reminiscent of what Aileen told Evan in the first book. And I think that repetition is really key to that oral tradition in ensuring what we know about ourselves and what we can transmit, not just to the next generations, but to everybody around us, right? And so that's the key of this oral practice of getting together and sharing things with each other, is that they get drilled into our psyches and into our identities and beings ultimately, right? That it becomes so natural that we can tell these histories when these histories have been neglected for so long by the colonial mainstream, right? And for so long, there's virtually nobody printing our stories, putting them in movies, putting them in songs, and so on. But now we have a growing abundance of books in fiction, science, nonfiction, poetry, plays, and so on. And we're having, more films, documentaries, plays, and so on in our languages, embedded in our identities and in our stories, and so on. And that's due to these stories that were kept alive by people who were literally risking their lives to share this knowledge, right? Because they endured brutal punishments, if not death altogether, at these horrific institutions that aim to erase who we are. But it didn't happen, so that's why we're here tonight. So for this last part, before we turn it over to y'all and have a conversation, I'll talk a little bit specifically of some of the practices I try to abide by in writing and in what we're doing tonight, sharing stories and meeting each other and so on. And I'll just leave 3, I think, key areas with you: memory, listening, and creating dialogue. And this is specific to writing, of course, to literary arts, but I think no matter what your artistic medium is, what your discipline is, I think you can probably find these tips applicable to what you do. Because this is a place where that kind of relationship building thrives, right? Where you're all hanging out with other creative people and sharing your practice and sort of learning from each other, emboldening each other, and ensuring that our ways of life are becoming immortalized, right? Which is a pretty powerful thing. So Indigenous people, around the world are known as orators. There's this whole concept of oral tradition that, is very, I think, hefty. But it is at the core of our knowledge transmission for sure, the stories that we've spoken to each other. Even when it happens in a colonial language, we're still speaking our truth, right? It's still a tool we're using to do that. But we always have used objects, many of us Indigenous nations, to aid in that storytelling practice. So these are just a few of those objects that Indigenous nations have used. You see at top is the wampum belt. In Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe culture, that's used to tell a story. That's the two-row wampum that sort of signifies the journey of Indigenous nations and settler nations, paddling beside each other on the river and so on. On the bottom left is what we call wigwas, birch bark. It's a birch bark scroll. In the Anishinaabe culture, we use that to document our stories, our teachings, and so on. And in the bottom right, that's called a kipu. It's a practice undertaken by Andean cultures in the Andes Mountains, where they would tie little knots and strings, and each of those knots would be a story or an element of a story. And these big sort of devices aided in that process, right? So I see books as very much another tangible object to help us convey and transmit our stories and our truths and so on. We can adapt our spoken stories to literature or other storytelling media. And I'll tell you a little bit about how I do that in the next few minutes. So first I want to give a shout out to Fred Wheatley, the late Fred Wheatley, an elder in our community of Waubgeshig. He was one of the people who regularly came into our school to tell us stories about ourselves, about our history, and so on. And this still image is from a video a friend of mine named Ray Pavlov gave to me several years ago. And Ray was he's a retired teacher. He taught in the Parry Sound area. And you'll see the timestamp. This is from 1988. He would regularly get Fred in to speak with kids from the res school and kids from the town schools, bring them all together. And, it was like an act of reconciliation before that became the word that it is today, right? But this video, he gave it to me years ago, and who has a VHS player anymore, right? So these tapes just collected dust on my shelf for literally years. So finally, when the pandemic came around, I was like, I got to finally find a way to digitize these. So I found a guy in Sudbury to put them into a little thumb drive for me and so on. So I watched all these videos, and it was like traveling through time. It was just amazing, hearing Fred tell his stories again, right? Because he passed on in the early 1990s, so it had been literally like 30 years since I'd heard his voice. But one of his teachings was about memory, and he was talking about that oral tradition in our culture and how memory helps define us as Anishinaabe. And one thing he said, and I'm paraphrasing in this teaching, was that if we don't use our memory, we're going to lose it and ultimately lose our sense of identity. So he said that's the point of the oral tradition, is to speak and to listen and to make space for that in your mind so that you can bring that up whenever you need to, right, in any storytelling moment. So I wrote about this in an article for the Globe and Mail from late 2020. I just quit my job at CBC. I was going through all kinds of weird stuff because of the pandemic too. Our second son was born at the time. I was starting to write Moon of the Turning Leaves, and I saw this video of Fred, and it just sort of brought everything back together in a pretty powerful way. So this, if you want to look it up, this article is called Why It's Important Not to Lose Oral Storytelling. It's from October 2020 in the Globe and Mail. And I'll just read this brief passage from it. And this is me talking about the importance of memory. It's a principle I learned early in life from Fred and other elders and family members. Hearing the old stories as a little kid in the 1980s is what helped me understand my Anishinaabe heritage and become deeply proud of it. I abided by that tradition for most of my young life, committing many of these stories and lessons to memory, and they have largely inspired my professional work as a journalist and author. But those careers rely on documentation as story validation. Every story shared for journalism and fiction is captured, written, edited, and more. The spoken story is only the beginning and not the end, as it has been in Anishinaabe culture since time immemorial. That divergence of foundational priorities has created a paradox for people like me who come from the oral tradition. Because I've become reliant on recording and writing stories for the past 2 decades, I can't help but wonder how much I have forgotten. This collision of storytelling worlds created a dilemma that I've been trying to reconcile in recent years. When I started imagining my latest novel, Moon of the Crested Snow, I resolved to carve the entire narrative into my memory before writing it down. I told myself that I needed to be able to tell someone a concise and comprehensive synopsis of the story before I started typing words into sentences on the screen. The novel was published in 2018 without many significant changes to the original structure I imagined and remembered. I'm currently doing the same thing for my next novel, which is a sequel to Moon of the Crested Snow. I've been allowing the story to gestate in my head over the past few months, and it'll take a few more before I have a finished narrative arc to remember. Although this method is by no means traditional Anishinaabe storytelling, it's inspired by the same principles and philosophies. The main plot and the story's morals are the most important elements. Often, the rest is up to each individual storyteller. So, some things I try to do, as mentioned, is remember the whole story in my head before I write it down, from start to finish. And there's no way I'm gonna verbatim tell you the words that I'm thinking of writing, right? I'm just gonna tell you the sequence of events before I do that. But I think it's a good practice for anybody to do. If you envision something, try to concisely summarize it for somebody else. Try to paint that picture in their head for them by describing it to them. Convey what's in your head to theirs through your voice and into their ears. And I think that helps create a really powerful relationship between you and that listener. And I think it can solidify the art that you're trying to create. You can think of your favorite stories, like personal stories, family stories, community stories, and just write them down as a practice of that. And ask your loved ones or other parties in those stories what they remember from that. Because memory is a tricky thing, right? Like it's often unreliable. What I remember about an event is what is different than how a friend or cousin is going to remember the same event, right? Yeah, just talk about your memories regularly, tell stories to others, go over them in your mind. But one of the most important practices, as mentioned, is being able to summarize it and tell somebody else. I think that's really effective in this sense. So moving on to listening. I found this article online a few years ago. It's called Decolonizing Creative Writing. It's about not conforming to techniques of the Western canon, written by Janice Periat, who's a creative writing professor at a university in India. It's a really cool article. I urge you to look it up if you can. It's free. There's no paywall there as far as I remember. But I'll read you this quick passage from later on in the piece. She says, slowly I've mustered up the courage to include sessions on listening in my creative writing courses. We now open the semester with students gathered around a virtual bonfire in these days of online teaching, telling stories to each other. We speak of silences, hesitations, circulatory, repetition, breath. We listen to podcasts, they record their own, and this active listening practice, I've noticed, informs their reading and writing for the rest of the semester. They're better attuned, I think, to pauses in the text, to how a character holds her silences, to how a story can be told in many ways. They're encouraged also in their fiction writing to draw on storytelling traditions, oral or otherwise. So that listening can extend to, all kinds of facets of your life. Of course, there's listening to people who are telling you stories, but we live in a heavily media-saturated society where we can access almost any kind of storytelling anywhere. So you can go to the radio, to TV, you can go online, to YouTube, podcasts, etc., and just listen, engage in the act of listening to how people tell stories, right? Look for moments where people are regaling somebody about something else or recalling a specific moment, and just listen to how their voice works, right? The dialogue they're speaking, the pauses, the trembles, and so on, right? One thing you can also do is record conversations you have with other people, with their consent, obviously, just to understand how you engage with people in an oral way, because it's kind of eye-opening, right? Not all of us have the opportunity to do that, but you learn a lot about yourself when you hear yourself speak to somebody else, so I encourage you to try that too. But yeah, just witnessing discussions, witnessing conversations is an important part of this sort of decolonizing the narrative process, because it humanizes who we are, no matter if we're Indigenous or not, right? And so lastly, I'll touch on dialogue. This is a still image from the movie adaptation of The Lesser Blessed, the Richard Van Camp novel that came out in 1996. The film adaptation was from 2012. Got to give a shout out to Richard Van Camp. Many of us are here because of him. He's like a big brother, big cousin, and uncle to so many of us. I read The Lesser Blessed when I was probably about 20, and it changed my life. One of the main reasons was the dialogue that he wrote. This is a story about Tlisho Dene community character, and I was brought into that moment, that fictional setting, based on a reality, thanks to the dialogue Richard wrote. And it was entirely relatable to my experience and upbringing as an Anishinaabe kid on the res, too. So Richard is an expert in dialogue, and I just want to give him a shout out there. And talking about dialogue, we always want to make it as natural and believable as possible. So we should be attuned to all the elements of dialogue, questions, slang, tone, volume, nonverbal responses, and so on. And figuring out ways to include those in our storytelling practice humanizes the speakers in our stories. A really important thing that I abide by always is speaking dialogue as I write it. So if I'm writing characters in dialogue, I say out loud what I'm making them say. And it's really helpful, especially if I'm trying to harness a particular vernacular or attitude or something like that, right? Makes me look like I'm losing my mind, sitting there talking and stuff, but it's really effective. And doing that, it's effective because how you envision dialogue in your head is really different from how it's ultimately spoken sometimes. So that can be really helpful. And when you're engaging with all those different kinds of dialogue and different artistic media, just be mindful of how they are different from medium to medium, right? Like dialogue in a TV show is different from dialogue in a play, is different from dialogue in a novel, and so on, right? So yeah, just be aware of how that's presented in different ways. So just to wrap up here, this is an image of my two oldest sons, Jikwis and Yabe. This is from our community powwow last September. This part of Wissahickon used to be a town called Depot Harbor, and it burned down after the Second World War, and our community was able to reclaim that land afterwards. And it's now where we hold our cultural celebrations, right? Our powwows there. We have Medewan ceremonies just not far from here. And I show this now because this is the future my boys are growing up into, right? And if we think about our ancestors, even our more recent ancestors, like our family members, many of them had been stripped of the opportunity to imagine a future. Yet here we are, being able to imagine a beautiful, fulsome existence within ourselves and with the communities around us, based entirely on our being, on our truth, on our realities, and so on. So that's a very fortunate, I think, opportunity that we all have, is to take this responsibility of a positive future and just being empowered by who we are as Indigenous people. So yeah, that's all I have to share with you. Miigwech.
Thank you for taking the time to share with us, as I mentioned, and just because I did actually take some journalism. I took Inca in First Nations University, and one thing that I always found between film and journalism is in film you really have to work to get a relationship with your subjects, and you can take a lot of time with them. And I wasn't so good at the journalism because I felt like I had to make quick relationships fast and then move on to the next thing. So for me, it was really difficult in terms of just taking the self-care, because you're coming into someone's story really quickly. And there's what we call vicarious trauma, which if you may not have experienced something, but in the act of hearing or witnessing, you can feel that trauma. So we do a lot of trauma training when I was early on in my career. And so I did learn, that we are impacted by each other. Mm-hmm. But also we could be impacted by good things too. So, there was quite early on in my career where I shifted from acknowledging the intergenerational trauma in my family to focusing on intergenerational healing. So, I still acknowledge the things, but I'm really focused on my kids. And that image that you had there, that you ended off with, is so powerful. And just the fact that I always say the privilege that I have is my kids have access to their teachings and they have no fear to practice them. So even now I notice elders, they're always careful sometimes with what they say because they have living memory of these policies that impacted our people. So very powerful, but I love how you contextualized it with family. And just to echo, Richard Van Camp is the one who mastered Zoom storytelling. Thought he was coming out of the screen with his stories. It's amazing. But yeah, I just wanted to thank you for sharing. But I also, wanted to acknowledge what you were talking a lot about. My dad shared, and I think as Indigenous people, I always like to point out oral footnotes. So we do that quite naturally. Yeah. But yeah, I just wanted to share that you shared a few influences, but share a little bit about the community influences and how that impacted you.
Oh yeah, it was massive, and this was happening. I learned after the fact during a time when not a lot of other communities were doing the same things or on a similar path, right? So I had really this front row seat to this revival, thanks to the efforts of my parents and their peers and many community elders and the leadership there too, right? And really, it was a response to the traumas that had been inflicted upon our community and our people. There was, an exhaustion, I think, and I can't speak for that generation, but I think there was an exhaustion with all the tragedy and all the hardship that resulted from being displaced, from being oppressed, and being brutalized by the state and so on. So I'm so fortunate and privileged that I grew up in sort of the response era to that. you know, when, you know, there was the powwows happening in our community for the first time in the 80s. And, you know, I went into a sweat lodge for the first time when I was probably like 7, you know, 6 or 7. And I went in my first fast when I was about 11. One really interesting story that I'll share is, you know, coming to the drum. So it was my dad and his buddies and their partners who, you know, undertook this effort to bring, you know, singing and dancing back to the community, right? So they would ask, you know, neighboring knowledge keepers to come in with a drum to teach them how to drum and sing, right? But then that knowledge keeper would have to take the drum home. So they needed a drum to practice on. And they eventually ended up getting like a bass drum from, you know, a kit, from a drum kit, you know, a rock band kit. And they just turned it on the side, right? And, you know, they had to make drumsticks too. So they took like tent poles and fishing rods and just taped foam around the end. So that's how I learned how to sing at the big drum, was with these tent pole drumsticks on this bass drum, right? So it's like, you know, a real punk rock way of like bringing back culture. And yeah, it's just like it was like by any means necessary, right? Because the community, many in the community wanted that healing, wanted that reconnection, and they found ways to do it, which was pretty awesome. And again, I was like a fortunate bystander to that. You know, not just a bystander, I shouldn't say that. I was invited to be involved in that, but it was sort of a natural thing in that sense too, right?
Yes. You know, just thinking about some of the, I guess, not protocols, but things we acknowledge when we're oral storytelling. You know, there's the repetition you mentioned. One thing I noticed, I'm always like, repetition is good, especially if it's important. You repeat, but it's always like, well, I don't want to be rude. And I'm like, well, that's normal, isn't it? And I realized, well, it's because that's how I was, you know, when I was raised, actually, I was learned to be mindful, not to talk. Not that I couldn't talk at all, but I had to think about what I was talking about first. Yeah. And I had to learn to listen first. And then I was, oh, okay. But the day that I learned that I could actually start talking more and sharing stories was because I thought that I had to have all the old lost stories, because that's what someone who wasn't actually an Indigenous person, was a teacher, said, if you don't have your old stories, then you're not Indigenous no more, or Indian at the time, because I was a child. And so I was really devastated because, you know, I didn't acknowledge the stories, but I know I've heard a lot of stories. And so I was crying. I was saying, Mom, I'm not Indian because I don't know stories. And I was like, she's like, well, you're making a story every day of your life. And so I was like, what do you mean? She's like, what'd you do yesterday? I went to the forest and I played there. There was nobody there. And then I started talking. And she's like, you just told me a story. She's like, you're making those stories. She said, sometimes we forget, but she's like, really instilled with me that it's our values and the teachings within those stories that were important to carry. But she did acknowledge that with many of those pillars that each of our family from different nations hold, that we can help rebuild some of the understanding, because we have lost family lines through the genocide, and through those family lines that are not with us anymore, some of those teachings will always be in the ether, is kind of how she said. But she said that doesn't mean that we're lost. She said, if you look at 2 stars, what's between them? So she said there's always room for that space. And so that was really important for me in terms of, now that I'm older, contextualizing those teachings. But, you know, just thinking about, because I'm 44, so I'm just a little younger. But thinking in the 20s, you know, there's a lot of like, you just do it. Yeah. And you don't understand why, and people want to know why, especially reporters. Yeah. Why did you do it? Because my mom said. But now looking back, you know, at your journey 20 years later from when you were young, you know, was there, I guess, any stories of connection or disconnection in terms of how people perceived your storytelling and the stories you should tell?
Oh yeah, for sure. You know, and there's always the apprehension of sharing via the colonial route, right? Whether it be journalism or fiction or whatever else. And I fully understand that apprehension and that sensitivity, because, as mentioned earlier, these were stories that were held in secret, because if they were shared out in the open, harm would be inflicted upon the people who shared them, you know? So I always thought, when I was working as a journalist, as my responsibility to be as accommodating as possible. And if somebody said, no, I don't want to do an interview or I don't want to tell you that story, I would say, fine, that's it. And then I go back to my assignment desk and say, no, they want to do the interview, right? And like, it's harder for like a colonial structure like that to accept that, you know, because they want that story done by the deadline. They needed that day to fill that hole in the newscast or whatever, you know? So I think every time I approached Indigenous people in urban Indigenous communities, no matter where I worked, whether it was like Winnipeg, Ottawa, Toronto, Sudbury, I always led with like my intentions and my identity and how this individual's health was the priority, you know, and if they didn't want to share anything, they were under no obligation to share anything with me, right? So my main conflict was with my bosses. It wasn't with community members because, you know, I was taught to enter into those situations with the utmost respect, you know, understanding my responsibility as that conduit, that potential conduit, you know? But I didn't care if I pissed off my white boss, whatever, you know? So I wanted to maintain the good relationships with the people in my community. So yeah, so that's one example, you know. I'm sure there are other moments too, but yeah, we've come a long way in general over the past 20 years in how, you know, Indigenous stories and experiences have been moved into these more mainstream spaces. And it's because of like the advocacy of grassroots Indigenous people. It's the community members that have really set the agenda, in my opinion, because, you know, you have movements like I Don't Know More, or you have the positive repercussions of the TRC that really forced Canadians to pay attention. So in that sense, you know, it made like my job as an Indigenous journalist a little bit easier because I'm like, you know, look at how much this tweet is being shared. You know, we have to do a story on this, right? So it became a measurable thing. But yeah, full credit goes to community members for that change, for sure.
Yeah, definitely. Like talking a little bit about TRC, I was a statement gatherer for the TRC for many years, so I actually heard hundreds of stories, both in sharing circles and one-on-one. And so when the calls to action came out, it was really difficult for me because I wasn't just hearing policy, which some people are like, oh, it's policy or recommendations, but I was hearing stories where these came from. These were based on people's experiences. And when I asked, I was like, well, because I thought it should be formulaic, like, just because I was young too. And they said, well, people have to interpret it too for themselves and how they want to uphold these thoughts. So, you know, that was really important for me. And then I was like, well, I don't think I can do all these calls to action in my lifetime. I was overwhelmed. They said, we don't expect you to. You know, everyone takes a piece. But if you champion one, you know, then that helps if people are taking the responsibility, and that my children might have to carry on that duty and to continue that. And so then, of course, I'm looking at my kids. Okay, now you're going to take this over. They were like 8 and 10. Sure. Just give us some time. But, you know, we do that actually, we instill those values at such a young age that we're not always direct, but I feel like we're planting the seeds for them to be good humans and identify their values. And so often when I think about how my mom was able to, she likes to break the cycle, is what she said when she talked about her residential school experience, she always said, that's not yours to carry. Maybe I want you to understand, but I don't want you to carry that. And so then I did the same thing because those cycles came with us to our communities. It wasn't like it just stopped at the doors of residential school. Yeah. Things followed. And so, you know, for me, breaking those cycles and acknowledging them for what, you know, happened was so important. But then I look at our generation now and, you know, they are dancing, they're singing, they have so much teachings and pride, they wear their skirts, there's no hesitancy. And, you know, for me, that gives me hope, you know, that we're moving in a good place. Yeah. So, you know, I think all the work that we do in bringing people together, I think you just nailed it when you kept saying connection. Because I think for me, that's what decolonizing is it's returning to our values, which for me is Wakotwin, which means you're all my family. You're all my brothers and sisters, no matter what background you come from. But it's hard to just say that. You have to embody those teachings. So I really loved what you were sharing. And so with that, you know, I do want to open up the room and online for conversation. And oh, we got one right away. So, And, I'm always we're also trying to figure out if we're all really related too, because I know Allie's trying to figure out if she's related. A couple Curve Lake people here, or somehow they might all be related.
Anishinaabe too, probably related somehow.
We're always trying to figure it
Amber
out.
too, Amber's Anishinaabe.
And maybe just for fun, maybe when you ask a question, say where you're from, where you're coming from.
Good evening. My name is Chinelo Nwalu. I'm from Nigeria originally, but I live in Toronto. I've lived there since 2018, so not very long. I am fascinated by this talk because I am also from an Indigenous storytelling tradition that is very strong with I'm Igbo from the southeast of Nigeria, and also working on a story that talks about recovery of lost cultural history into the future. As a former journalist myself, my question is, so what is the balance between the need for documentation and verification that you had mentioned earlier, and in the recovery of lost histories and traditions, especially when those histories and traditions have only been preserved through stories? When you're relying on the oral record to recreate the traditions and past that were intentionally destroyed by colonial processes, where does the need for verification and documentation come in, and how can we find the balance between those things?
That's a really good question, Miguesh. Thanks for asking it. I think the need for documentation is at its utmost right now. I think we need to document as much as possible, and I think that would have been taboo maybe 30, 40 years ago in terms of printing some of those more sacred stories. But at this point, there's been so much lost already that I think we should be printing as much as possible, right, in terms of some of these histories and so on. I think the verification comes naturally, though, because if a few people get together and decide that it's okay to print one particular story, then that's the verification in and of itself, I think, because we do things in a communal way, right? If somebody just individually decided to, write a whole book about, how the sweat lodge came to be or something like that. There are some very sacred teachings behind that from culture to culture. And if one person did that, they may run afoul of several other knowledge keepers, because there's no consensus or communal verification process in terms of how to undertake that. But I think of the Mishomis book that Eddie Benton Benai published almost 50 years ago now. He came upon some pretty big backlash for doing that, but it's become an integral part of our history because it's a touchstone in many ways. And the other side of that is you run the risk of not necessarily commodifying, but maybe making a novelty of some of these teachings, but at the same time, someone who has been displaced historically from their community or their people and needs to find a way back, a book won't ultimately solve that, but it's a good reference for them to, make that connection once again, I think. So yeah, and I'm not an elder, I don't have, the expertise or the authority to rubber stamp printing these stories, but at the same time, I've seen the benefit of how some of these stories are shared and how they're reaching people in urban areas and people who have been displaced, whether it's through the 60 Scoop or, intergenerational trauma from residential schools and so on, right? So that's not to say I believe in printing everything, but I think, we need to be a little more flexible and a little more liberal when it comes to conceptualizing that and actually making it happen, for sure.
I'm going to go with you right here because you're very close.
Hi, yeah, I'm just from Edmonton, Treaty 6 territory, and I'm a naturally very nosy person. So I actually wanted to kind of go back to something you were talking about earlier in your talk when you posted that image of the Toronto skyline and how much it had kind of struck you and how the event had struck you. Coming from a journalism background and working in journalism for so long, were there times where you worked on something or wrote a piece of nonfiction that kind of called to you or drew you to move that into fiction? Or were you like, no, this is fine as an article, and you didn't want to fictionalize it in any way? And I guess I'm kind of asking as well, like, how do you know when something is a story, you know, sort of big S story versus like small s story, like nonfiction? And do you think it's kind of related to aiming at two different sets of readers?
Well, that's a good question, Premi. I think I don't think there was like a particular story or stories that I, you know, was motivated to write in fiction. It was definitely human responses to certain stories that I wanted to, I think, really try to convey, try to understand, and see how that could live in a different form to humanize a group of people, I guess. And, you know, ethically, of course, I would never just take someone's story that I interviewed and just write it in a novel, right? But I think there are so many truths that a lot of marginalized people have been able to convey in media that need to live on in different forms with additional context. And sometimes fiction is the best way to do that. So obviously you won't take that exact story, but you'll take that reaction or that emotional response, and because you have more space in fiction, you can contextualize a little bit more of you know, where they're from, what their hopes and dreams are, who their family is, et cetera, et cetera. Because like I worked in broadcasting where a TV story was just 2 minutes long, right? And it would frustrate me to no end whenever I only could put a 10-second clip of what that person had to say in the story, you know? So yeah, like to answer your question, it was just wanting to let that experience live in a different way, to reach more audiences, but mostly to humanize that person, right? And I think what I've really been fortunate to do with fiction is humanize the Anishinaabe experience, because that's something that's been denied our ancestors for so long. And you know, your question about big S story or small S story, I think what I'm envisioning, I guess, when I'm talking to that person is just how somebody else might feel if they're able to connect or engage with their story or their elements of their story that I'm able to share in this different medium, I guess, right? So yeah, there's a lot of care and a lot of consideration has to go into that. But ultimately, it's about making those human connections, right? And that's our job, as you know, as well as I do. That's our job as novelists, is to evoke empathy in a reader, you know, to transcend our backgrounds to find that universal human feeling or dream or desire or whatever else, right? So yeah, I think that's how I feel about it. So thanks.
I'll pop over and see Susie, and then I think we have 2 online as well.
Sounds good.
All right. But I'm ready to run.
Hi, thank you. Waub, I'm from Fort Smith, and thank you for recognizing Richard Van Camp. He's, very amazing to us as well. And my question would be, how are you reacting to Daniel Smith, who has taken Richard's one book, or the lesser blessed, off the shelves in the libraries in Alberta? And I mean, there's always Indigenous funny humor, and he said, I'm really glad, because when I watched him, his rebuttal, he said, hey, I'm right up there with the Margaret Atwoods, So it's pretty shocking, as much growth as we've done as Indigenous people, taking back our culture, our language, and so forth, and telling our stories. How can Daniel Smith try to snuff one of our writers, in this 2025?
Yeah.
Totally. I'm shocked and upset as an Albertan, and I know where my vote's going to go. But just wanted to get your opinion on that.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Susie. Yeah, it's dystopian in many ways, right? But like that's a cowardly act of dehumanization and delegitimization of marginalized people, and it comes out of fear, mostly a fear of losing control of the narrative, right? And a politician like that, that's all they have. That's their only currency, is the ability to control the narrative. But because so many of us from so-called marginalized backgrounds, have the capacity, have the space to speak our truths and to be present in these mainstream spaces, it's irreversible, right? Like, no matter how hard someone like that tries, it's never going to silence the movement that's begun. So I find moments like that, like, of course it's tragic, but it's also like kind of humorous, like to see this act of cowardice unfold and become a story, because like Richard's stories are immortal. They're never gonna die, right? They're gonna inspire youth for generations to come, no matter what the politician of the day tries to do, So what we're doing now is a perfect kind of response to that. Is just making sure that people like Richard's stories are still in the spotlight, and that we're still getting those books into the hands of young people.
I'm going to chime in quickly, because as soon as someone tells me I can't do something, I'm going to do it.
Yeah, for sure.
Here, we'll come run over here. And then I saw a hand over here. I'll come back. I'm coming back. It's more people.
Hello, everyone. I'm representing the people who are on Zoom right now. So we have a question from Dawn Mailhot. I'm very sorry if I butchered your last name. From Treaty 6 territory. Their question is, with settler history showing us wood-covered bays, multi-week power blackouts, bison calls, 60 scooped, residential schools, and many other apocalyptic scenarios, it's hard not to pull on what some might call dystopian narratives. As a writer interested in pulling from similar narratives, I was wondering what advice you might give to someone trying to balance some of those darker story arcs with something like hope, love, language, and lesson.
Well, that's a good question. All I can speak to is what I tried to do is like pull the hope or the positivity out of those moments, which is what I learned growing up from my family, from my community. Being shown the light through those dark times, like, obviously, there are several dystopian things happening, in Canada, especially in the United States, but. I think back to like some of the earlier authors of color who've taken on dystopian or post-apocalyptic stories as a good model, because if you think of like the stories in the so-called canon, like 1984, Brave New World, Fahrenheit 451, et cetera, right? I'm going to use, some swear words as I describe this, so I apologize in advance. But like the gist of many of those works written from the dominant perspective is, this is the road we're going down, and we're fucked, no matter what, right? But if you read books by like Octavia Butler, like Parable of the Sower, the point of that book is, well, we've been fucked already, but here's how we're creating something good in the aftermath of that. So I think, we can look at the darkness of our time for sure, and really try to tap into that, bonding human experience, right? And I think that's what Parable of the Sower does for sure. The Marrow Thieves does that excellently too. Future Home of the Living God by Louise Erdrich. Just powerful book. It's a little darker too, but like the communal aspect of that is what I think brings the reader along into like an opportunity to feel hope, I guess. So my response to that would be like, think about how you're responding as an individual to all these wild things happening, and really tap into that, and have all the shitty things just as the backdrop, right? And that sort of allows like humanity to emerge in a really beautiful way.
Amazing, thank you. I have a second question from Cy Singer. I wonder if you have ever thought of writing a novel of different characters all telling the same story. I'm curious about this because you have said each person can tell a story in a different way, but it's got certain fixed elements.
Oh, that's a good question. I'm sort of trying that with the novel I'm working on now, which is a departure from these last two books. It's a different standalone story. And I think the challenge is like, to have these distinct portrayals of an event, he has showed the interconnectedness between these characters. And again, I'm gonna underline, like, I'm not a fiction writer by training. Like, I taught myself along the way just by reading books, right? So my literary expertise is pretty minimal, to be honest, right? But, you know, all I can do is try, and what I want to do is, like, write a story that entertains me, first and foremost, because otherwise, you know, why would I spend years of my life doing something that I don't enjoy, you know? But, yeah, so I think I'm trying that. Hopefully it's working. My editor doesn't think it's garbage yet, so that's a good sign. But I'll, you know, to the questioner, you know, get back to me in a few months and we'll see how I really feel about that. Thanks for that, though.
All right, I'm coming.
And we had a question in the back.
Oh, yes, over here. And then I think one behind you. Yes, work off those chicken strips.
The chicken strips are so good. Thank you. I want to say, first of all, thank you so much for this really beautiful talk. It's been such a pleasure to hear it. My name is Amal. I'm from Ottawa. My family is from Lebanon. But actually, the question that I have, like, I heard what Janila was saying about being from another storytelling tradition, and it feel like that's something that I could say, except for colonialism. And so I actually don't have access to a lot of the oral stories of, like, my family background. What I have instead is a lot of English literature, so much that I have been through. And as a consequence, like, the question that I have is kind of still about that relationship between the oral and the written, but kind of more from the same dynamic in a different place, if that makes sense. I spent a bunch of time studying romantic Scottish literature, and there's this really interesting phenomenon with, like, Sir Walter Scott, where he spends some time roaming the Scottish borders, collecting, with big scare quotes, folk songs from people, and writing them down in this collection that ends up being called Minstrelsy of the Scottish Border. And there's another Scottish writer, James Hogg, whose mother was part of this collection process, who was kind of furious at the end result, and that she was like, they were neither well written nor right set in Dune and stuff like that. She was just like, she said that, you know, by putting them in writing, Scott had basically killed something in them. And that kind of tension, I feel like, persists a lot in a lot of different areas when you're trying to both preserve something, but also when the act of preservation essentially kills it in some way, or there's that fear. And so I was wondering, though, because of what Janine was saying about, like, what her mother said about, like, when you don't know stories, the fact that you are from the position where you are inventing new stories kind of fills this gap. I was actually, this is so much background for a quite banal question. I was just wondering, is there within Indigenous storytelling a sense of, like, an oral tradition being about or containing transformation of the stories from teller to teller? Or is it the fact of, like, the necessity of writing things down to preserve them within, like, the threat of colonial dominance and everything that kind of produces the need for accuracy, specificity, and repetition? Like, is it the fact that we're writing them down that makes them feel more fragile, essentially? And if we didn't, would the fact of just telling them over and over allow for variation to not seem like it was distorting or threatening? Does that make sense? I hope it makes sense.
It makes total sense. Yeah, thanks for that, Amal. Appreciate it. I think getting back to something you mentioned earlier, you know, that detachment, or whatever you want to call it, or disconnection or displacement from that oral tradition, or from, like, that land-based cultural tradition, is still a story, as Janine was saying, right? And I think anybody who feels that should not be ashamed of that, because it's not their fault. You know, colonialism is not our fault, and you know, from your background and your experience too, right? So that's a legitimate story to tell, and everybody deserves to tell their own story. and that's part of the entire fabric that we are as colonized people, as so-called marginalized people, right? There are different ways into our identities and our stories, and we can learn from everybody, no matter how they make that connection or how they express making that connection too. And in that sense, like, I think the oral and written can complement each other. Like, you know, of course, I said I'm a proponent for documenting everything. I should have clarified that, like, more heavily on the historical side, you know, because these histories, you know, predate these states by, you know, thousands of years, and these histories are assisting us in coming into our own politically, financially, culturally, socially, and so on today. I speak, I think, more explicitly of the treaty process. Where we're from, in the Robson Huron Treaty Territory, we received last year a big settlement for treaty annuities that hadn't been paid for, you know, 170 plus years. And it was brought to court. Our communities, 21 of our Anishinaabe communities on the North Shore of Lake Huron, sued the federal and provincial governments for these annuities that they had never paid, right? So it was a case heard in colonial court by a justice. And what won it for us were these oral histories that were irrefutable because they had been enshrined in our identities, and they had been documented in some ways, right? But because it was such widespread communal knowledge, the court had to give it weight as evidence, you know? So in that sense, that's what I think needs more of the documentation, for sure. And of course, like the cultural or ceremonial stories can attach themselves to that at the same time too. Like in some of those testimonies in this Robson Huron Treaty case, there were stories about like the constellations and what they inform us of and how they guide us to relate with each other on the land and so on. And this is documented evidence in this court case, right? Which is pretty awesome, you know? And you know, what you said about the flexibility or fluidity of certain stories, I think that's part of the process which makes it so beautiful too. And I think that relates more to I guess the cultural or entertaining or maybe fictional stories. Like, I don't want to call them like myths or fairy tales or anything like that, but that's like how you could translate them in like a modern or mainstream context. You could hear like, there's in Moon of the Crested Snow, I wrote the story about Nanabush and the geese, which is also known as Nanabush and the Dancing Ducks. And if you go from community to community, the story's going to be told in different ways, right? But the same elements are going to be there, and the same moral in the end is how it's going to finish, you know, with that teaching at the end of the story, you know? So I think that's, you know, I think it's a really cool thing to see how these stories can change from place to place, ultimately with that same teaching coming out in the end. So yeah, I think that touches on what some of you brought up, but thanks for raising all that, you know, all really important stuff to talk about, for sure.
So just to wind down, because we are at our time, you know, I do really love that question, just because, you know, something that really hit me when I was writing my master's, which was all about decolonizing my family history, using oral storytelling and documentary. But you know what really hit me on that was my mom said, we're so quick to label something good or bad, we forgot it's a tool, and how we use it is really that label. But she also told me never to label people, because people can't undo a label, but they can change a behavior. So sometimes how we contextualize our knowledge is so important. But we tend to put so much emphasis on the validness of, say, a document, but how many people are living with names that are miswritten, birthdays that are not documented properly. My Chapan, my great-grandmother who passed, was verbally, through oral history, 116 years old, but on paper she was 106. Still both pretty great. But, you know, sometimes I think it's just we have to do some of that work, and we as storytellers have a responsibility for the knowledge we put out into this world. And that also means sometimes we have the responsibility of things we shouldn't share until someone is ready for that knowledge. But at the same time, we have to also share that knowledge too in order to build the understanding. So that nuance is that interesting kind of way we navigate. And so for me, you know, I think I'm learning, and I think I realized at 44, I am not wise at all, but I will get there one day.
Same here.
But, you know, I think that's what my mom said. When you say that, you're starting to become wise. But with that, you know, I really want to thank you for sharing, because, you know, oral storytelling could actually be something that we sit with right from when I was by a campfire. That's when I started. And it goes ongoing in life. So some stories can take years and years just to learn. And so this is just that, I guess, encouragement to take what you learned and to continue that knowledge at your tables at home. Because I always feel like we learn so much in these settings, but the hardest is to take those conversations to our own dinner table, sometimes with even our own family. And that takes more courage than having a conversation with a stranger, I would say, because I have to live with them, or not. But, you know, with that, you know, thank you for taking time to sit with us, because, you know, as much as I like doing events, we can't have an event without the people who come and hear and share and exchange those stories with us. So I actually like to acknowledge you for being here, and for you online as well. And to my team and Anders as well, who generously comes and supports Indigenous arts and Indigenous initiatives here at the Banff Centre. So we know that having that relation to community is so important. So with that, you know, wherever you're going, whether it's to the hotel room, the Mac Lab, or off to Calgary, you know, I wish you a safe journey, and yeah, to take what you heard with you and yeah, echo it out. So, Tiniki.
Wish.